my name is Ross Dixon from the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. I'm going to do some proper introductions once we get started, but please do let us know where you're calling in from. So Chicago, Regina, New York, Phoenix, Toronto, Oregon, Madison. The competition, Christine, is to try and find the most exotic. Australia, okay, there we go. So this is, we've had Costa Rica and Australia, which is fun.
Utah, Boston, Victoria, Vancouver.
Chilliwack, more local to me, Pennsylvania. This is fun.
This is really fun.
It's fun.
From Mexico, hola.
Oh, there we go. Where else? So yeah, as everyone just signs in here, just to let you know, we will do some proper introductions in a moment. We just usually let people kind of sign in here and just let us know where you're calling in from in the chat. And as we go through, we'll do our best to take questions. You can ideally post questions in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. Yeah, and in the meantime, please just keep letting us know where you're calling in from because we find it really exciting.
This is so cool.
It is, right? Yeah, it's interesting to see, like obviously Raincoast work focuses on British Columbia, but wolves have this just such a broad appeal, and I love just seeing the fact that people are calling in from all over North America.
Oh, Arjun from India, that's exciting.
Yeah. I think I probably need one of those map boards on my wall so I can stick pins for wolf school call-ins, make sure we get every continent. I have Germany, Panama, Ohio. Okay. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll probably get started here just so we can make sure we've got. I'm just going to respond to one of my colleagues here a second. 1 second. Participants. There we go. Sorry, I'm just doing some technical stuff, making my colleague a co-host.
Yes.
There we go. I think we're good, Alex. Okay, so welcome to I think this is now the 4th episode of Wolf School. My name is Ross Dixon. I work for the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. We started this Wolf School just a few weeks ago as a way really of starting to share a little bit more about the nature of wolves and conservation issues that they face, not just here in British Columbia where Raincoast works, but all around the world. We've partnered with the Wolf Conservation Centre, who featured in one of our earlier episodes as a co-host of the Wolf School. Yeah, we're excited tonight to have Cristina Mittermeier with us, and I'm going to give you an introduction in a second there. And I also just wanted to acknowledge where I'm calling in from. So if we were pre-COVID and maybe doing this in a different way in a physical space, then we would acknowledge the territory that we're calling in from, and we still want to do that. So I'm calling in from my home in North Vancouver, which is the territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish and Musqueam Nation. And in our next episode, actually next week, we're going to have someone from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation join us, and we're going to hear some different perspectives, some Indigenous perspectives on wolf conservation. So I'm just going to move my windows around here a little bit. And now I want to introduce you to Cristina. Cristina Mittermeier. She's a photographer and marine biologist, has spent the last 25 years working as a writer, conservationist, and photographer. She graduated from the University of Mexico and has a degree in biochemical engineering and marine science, and also attended the Fine Arts School program at Cochrane College, if I'm saying that correctly. Great, that's good. In 2005, Cristina founded the International League of Conservation Photographers to provide a greater and bigger platform for photographers working on conservation and environmental issues. And more recently, in 2015, Cristina co-founded Sea Legacy, a non-for-profit that is dedicated to protecting the ocean with her partner and Canadian photographer Paul Nicklin. Cristina's won numerous awards, including the Mission Award from the North American Nature and Photography Association, and the Smithsonian Conservation Photographer of the Year Award. She's a member of the World Photographic Academy and was named one of National Geographic's 2018 Adventurers of the Year. So welcome to you, Cristina.
Thank you so much. It's fun to be part of Wolf School.
Yeah, we're kind of excited to have you and by how popular it's proving. And I wanted to, like, before we get into the kind of the wolves, I really wanted to explore this topic of conservation photography with you. And in doing my own Wolf School homework, I came across this piece you wrote in the International Journal of Wilderness that would help to define conservation photography. And there's a piece that I pulled out that I want to just share back with you, is that, and this is what was written there: there is an additional step that can be taken by the nature photographer, one in which the practitioner is not just interested in documenting nature or creating works of art, but in making images that in fact protect the subject they depict. This is conservation photography. So now I really want to explore that and hear a little bit more about what led you to even advocate for that as a discipline, that conservation photography.
That's such a fun question, because you're the first person in all these years that's asked me that, or who has dug out that paper, and I wrote that in 2005 because I was just starting my career as a nature photographer. And in the beginning, I wanted to be a wildlife photographer, but I was raising 2 kids of my own and then a stepson as well. And I figured out pretty quickly that it's just too difficult to be a nature photographer, to commit to going away and living in a blind and spending weeks and weeks waiting for the perfect moment. So I still wanted to take pictures of nature, and I started attending nature photography conferences. There's a number of them that are international, where all photographers come in and they talk about, the trends of the industry. They talk about the equipment. And I think everybody knew, even back then in 2005, that things were not okay. But we only talked about environmental issues very marginally. So I was one of the few women. It was very male dominated, very white dominated. And I would raise my hand and I would say, excuse me, can we talk about how we can use our photographs maybe to highlight the places or the species that we're photographing, so that maybe we can, help connect the dots to protection. And I was literally told to shut up and sit down. Yeah. They thought that environmentalism was too polarizing. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. I started figuring out, that most photographers, amateur photographers, are people of means. They're usually retired lawyers and doctors, they just want to take pictures. They just like the equipment. But I noticed at the same time that some of my favorite photographers and the people that I really admired were people that were involved in projects that were not exclusively nature photography. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So there were a bunch of people that were photographing just like flowers and birds in their backyard, and they were called nature photographers. Then there were people like Michael Nichols, who had just walked 2,000 miles from the rainforest in Cameroon all the way to the coast of Gabon, following the trails of wild elephants and documenting an ecosystem that nobody had ever seen. And he published this in National Geographic, and that could have been enough, but he took it upon himself to take those images to the president of Gabon and explain to him, the uniqueness and the value of the biodiversity in his own country. And, through that perseverance, that additional step, they were able to create 13 new national parks. Wow. He too was called a nature photographer. And I thought, there's a huge discrepancy between what these two people do. So let's define it. And that initial paper, I started writing it after I came back from a trip to Tasmania. It was like a family vacation, but everywhere I went, I would go to these little, coffee shops and gas stations and find these beautiful postcards. So I started collecting them, and they were by a photographer called Peter Dombrovskis. And so as I traveled throughout Tasmania, I collected more and more, and eventually I made it back to the capital. How can I forget the capital of Tasmania? Anyway, Hobart. Yes, what am I saying? Hobart. Yeah, Hobart. And I went to a bookstore and I bought the last copy of the book. It's called Wilderness by Peter Dombrovskis. And in doing research about him, I realized that he had been a very quiet man. He was not an advocate. He was not a campaigner. But when he realized that the government of Australia was going to dam places where he photographed the watershed of the Franklin and the Gordon River, he put his photographs to work. He published them in magazine articles, in newspapers. He didn't give, vociferous interviews, but he lent his work for the campaign. And the Premier of Australia, back then, Premier Grey, had said, there's nothing up there. It's just a leech-ridden swamp. But Dombrowski's, with his quiet photographs, demonstrated that it was actually beautiful, biodiverse, and very worthy of protection. And guess what? They won. They not only protected the watersheds of these two rivers, they created the first and the largest wilderness area in the world. And I thought, see, that's how you do it. And that's what got me thinking into this and trying to find the photographers who, like me, were using his work in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I came across his name in reading your work, and it's one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is, and you mentioned this in the papers, and some of your research that I saw in Science and Nature about, like, especially say, like your scope at Sea Legacy is the entire ocean. And I'm kind of curious if you can share a little bit more about, given like the scale of the challenge, like how do you, from your perspective as a conservation photographer, how do you choose like what priorities to work on yourself for your own work?
It's another great question, Ross. So before I was a photographer, I was a scientist, and I was publishing. I mean, I honestly thought that the scientific world, the literature that we can produce was going to be enough to convince, decision makers and policy makers of protecting these places. You very quickly realize that very few people actually can read a scientific paper. And most people, when they're confronted with data and graphs, they recoil because they don't have enough background information to process. And so you feel stupid, so you reject it, right? It was by accident that I realized that photography is very powerful. And it was during the publication of a series of books that were based on one of those scientific articles. Ecologist Norman Myers, he had come up with this idea of the hotspots. And basically it boiled down to an important question. In a world where we have very limited resources, financial and human, to understand and protect biodiversity, where do you make an investment to get the most bang for your buck? And so the analysis of the hotspots was looking at the entire planet, mostly at that time it was terrestrial only, but asking, so where do we find the most diverse, unique, endemic, and endangered biodiversity? And we found 17 places around the world, places like Madagascar that had already lost 90% of its original forest. And yet the biodiversity that was left there was so unique and so special, so worthy of protection. Not the same as, say, the Canadian tundra. Very important, very beautiful, but not a big number of species. So that's how we were deciding where to make those investments in conservation. And we did the same for the oceans. I helped publish a paper later based on coral reefs. And so it was always shocking to me that most nature photographers don't take the time to ask themselves, not just what's beautiful and what's easy to photograph, but what's important. What's the rare, the unique, the endangered that nobody has ever photographed and we know so little about. And so that's where I wanted to spend my time.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. It's a challenging task, and I'm kind of curious to ask you about another piece of, like, Raincoast has a really well-defined now, like a wildlife welfare ethic, right? And this relates directly to wolves. And when we're thinking about, it's not just about populations of wild animals, we need to apply welfare principles. And we've kind of repeated this on Wolf School a few times because it's so important that we need to consider the individual welfare of animals, including wolves, when we look at conservation work and our activities generally. And more recently, we've looked at our own ethics around conservation photography to think, okay, like, what types of images are we using? How are we getting them? Like, and beyond, like, like general principles of crediting and seeking to compensate people when we're able to do that, but more broadly about, especially about how those images might impact the wildlife. And I'm kind of curious if you could share a little bit more about your own thoughts about, like, the ethics of wildlife photography when we're thinking about engaging with, like, individual groups of animals.
Oh God, another important question. So, from the beginning of the International League of Conservation Photographers, I became part of a community of photographers that were really concerned with this question, because it's easy to cheat your way into a photograph that gets you close and gets you action. And you know, there's abundant examples of that, but those photographs are often really detrimental to the welfare, not just of the animals you're photographing, but of the human communities that live around. Take, for example, you know, there's a whole industry around feeding brown bears dog food in places like Finland, because photographers come and photograph them. So, you know, why not bring the bears closer? Well, dog food is not a great source of nutrition for bears, so they're probably not getting what they need. They're coming in too close to animals, getting used to, being close to humans and overconfident. And eventually you end up having a conflict with an animal, and guess who ends up dying? It's the bear, not the photographer. And so I wanted really to create this whole other ethical layer around the beauty of what it means to go and put yourself in an ecosystem and search for an image that you really earn, because you have gained the trust of the animal that you're there to photograph and protect. And so at some point it became just so crystal clear in my mind. Photographers that are asking the question, how do I make money, are those who are not really interested about the welfare of animals. If the first question you're asking is how are my images going to work to protect this, then you're going to have that additional layer, this moral compass that guides your actions. And it's absolutely true that you can be a very successful photographer and still be an ethical photographer. You have to put in a lot more work. Did you know, Ross, that there's facilities in the United States where you can rent an animal that's been captured from the wild? You know, and these facilities will often tell you that these animals are rehabilitated, blah, 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 but they're breeding them. I mean, we all saw the Tiger King. So you can rent yourself a cougar or a wolf or a bear to take photographs that you exploit professionally to make money. And so very few photographers are actually putting any of that money back into conservation. So I find that morally reprobable, and I don't think there's any worth or beauty in a photograph that was taken that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. We added that piece because, you know, we found ourselves that sometimes we would inadvertently use an image like that and not actually realize that it wasn't. And sometimes, obviously, we might use an image of a captive animal in the right context, but generally, it's inauthentic and it's potentially exploitative. There's a question I wanted to take here from Oliver Starr, who I think I might have actually met once in Lake Tahoe. But anyway, he says, "Hi, Cristina, I hope you can speak to something pretty controversial, and it relates directly to what we've been talking about here. In Yellowstone, the regular photographers are on the wolves from dawn to dusk nearly every day of the year because they get telemetry off the collars. I believe this makes the wolves much more vulnerable as it habituates these animals to believe that the human presence is benign. Then when wolves step out of the pack during hunting season, they're unaware that there are different watchers with different roles. They don't understand the distinction or threat." And it's a big question, but I'm kind of curious to hear your response. What can be done to diminish this impact?
You know, it's a great question. And it's one of those, you know, when we look at the world today and what's happening, it's almost like we're out of easy answers. Every answer that I put forth now is going to be the wrong answer because we have painted ourselves into a corner that is so difficult. So I think about the wolves of Yellowstone. I know that a lot of the property owners, the ranchers around, would rather have no wolves at all. So it's miraculous that we have these packs there and that we have them collared. And it is a shame and a sad thing that humans only assign value to nature when there's some, you know, a dollar tag assigned to it. And photographers pay money to go and photograph. So they're giving the animal a value that, you know, in my mind, of course, they don't need to have, but the truth is that there's so many people that would rather see no wolves at all. So I don't know where we find the balance, where we find that we all dream of this utopia where we can inhabit the world in harmony with animals. It's getting more and more and more difficult every day. Yeah. Now, the other side of the equation is some of these photographers are actually telling great stories. And if nobody knows about the value and the beauty of wolves, would anybody care to protect them? So I don't know the answer.
Yeah, it's good. I think we find
it'll keep me up tonight. You know, I'll be up at 4 a.m. thinking about it. So thank you.
Yeah, good, and thanks for the question, Oliver. Like, I wanted to kind of almost inch us closer to the wolves, and I'm kind of curious, like, if you could share a little bit about like your own journey to your own experience of wolves, maybe anywhere, but also I'm kind of particularly curious of how you got towards your own experience of wolves in British Columbia.
Well, it was thanks to Paul Nicklin. When I met Paul, he was the top shooter at National Geographic, and it's a tradition in the magazine that you start your process there by becoming somebody's assistant. So I was Paul's fixer and assistant. I had been here in British Columbia before doing a rapid assessment visual expedition with Ian McAllister in the Great Bear, but I didn't get to see the wolves. I had been dedicated to photographing the indigenous communities, the Gitgat First Nation that protects and they're great stewards of that piece of land. But when I started dating Paul, he was doing his second assignment in National Geographic. He had been sent back to the Great Bear to photograph coastal wolves. And I didn't know anything about these animals. Like most people, I didn't even know that we had this amazing animal that is so distinct from a timber wolf. And the first time I saw them, you almost are puzzled, because they look scrawny and they're small and they behave in such a different manner. They almost look like a dog. And so the first time I saw wild wolves ever was in British Columbia on a little island here in Vancouver Island. And I was very surprised. It was not the magnificent timber wolf I had expected. But somehow, when you spend time with these animals and you learn a little bit about their behavior, you just fall in love with them. And it's an amazing thing to watch the family relationships. And they're so smart, so adaptable.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. That leads me into the next question is, and we will get to, so everyone knows, we will be looking at some pictures of wolves from Cristina in a little bit. But before we get there, I'm kind of really curious to know a little bit more about like the amount of work that it actually takes in advance of getting there. Like we talked about this a little bit in our kind of green room time, as it were. But I'm curious if you could tell us, like, give us a sense of what goes into like organizing and planning a trip, like to go and say shoot wolves, as it were.
When you finally make it to the leagues of National Geographic, you are part of a very elite group of photographers that are actually very well funded to do the work that they do. And Paul's work was no different. So we actually spent probably 6 months planning out the trip. But in reality, the logistics of making things happen were a 20-year history of relationships that Paul had here with people who knew where the wolves were, the indigenous people that granted us access to their territories, scientists like Chris Darremont, who was willing to share important scientific data. And it's this network of relationships that you build over time, what actually makes you a successful photographer, because it's very difficult to just say, I'm going to go to Vancouver Island and find some wolves. Not that easy. Yeah. And anybody can go and find a pack of wolves that everybody else is photographing. Like there's a report now that there's a dead sperm whale somewhere here on Vancouver Island, and there's a bunch of photographers who have been spending time there. Much more different to go find a wild pack of wolves that is raising pups or doing something really natural and wild. That takes time. And so you end up hoping for a location, building a blind that's usually just a couple of lawn chairs covered by some of that camouflage material, and you want to make yourself invisible. And then you proceed to spend days and weeks sitting in silence, hoping that the wolves will come out of their hiding because they know exactly where you are, and that they're going to do something amazing in front of you.
Yeah, and that's one of the other questions I'm curious about is, like, presumably you also spend that, like, some of that time just to try to understand whether it's wolves or other animals, the language that they do speak, right? Like, again, it relates to like the challenge and the complexity of like the images that you might select is like, how do we know, like, and we can maybe talk about this when we look at some of the images, but like, presumably it's also about, like you mentioned, Chris Darremont's work, but also understanding the behavioral ecology of the individual animals. So you would know when they're indicating that they're disturbed and nervous and so on. And obviously once you're there, there's limits over what you can do to, fix that issue. But I'm kind of curious, like like how much attention goes into those aspects of just understanding like the behavioral ecology of animals.
Well, the place that Paul and I found to photograph these wolves, because he had seen a picture that had been taken by one of the First Nations wildlife guides, and he knew the location. So it was this beautiful stream. It's in a very remote island, completely uninhabited, and the pack was raising the wolves in the forest, the babies in the forest, but they would bring them out to this meadow to play. And that's the picture that Paul wanted. Mm. And so we sat on that meadow by the edge of this creek for 6 weeks, Ross. And it was brutal because you have to get up in the morning at 4 a.m. and you creep, you basically trying to get to the blind when it's still dark. You'd come in on a paddleboard or a kayak, and then you get into the blind and you sit there hoping that in the beautiful morning light, the wolves are gonna come out. But they don't, So then you wait all day, hoping that maybe in the beautiful afternoon light, just those 20 minutes before the sun sets, maybe the mom will bring the babies out. No, they don't come. So you get back out of the blind, you go back to your tent, and you do it all over again and again and again. So Paul Necklin had said to me, it was my first experience with really wild animal photography. And he's very experienced. He said to me, no matter what you do, we cannot leave this blind. They know we're here, but they need to understand that we're not a threat, that we're not just, moving around and doing anything that's unpredictable. And so we did. I had all the 5 books of the Game of Thrones series. I sat there, I read, you eat peanuts, you count them, you put them in your hand 10 at a time, and I'm gonna eat one every minute. Pass the time, right? But maybe on week 3, because we could hear the wolves, you could hear them, they're calling in the forest, and Paul was going crazy because we're running out of money. National Geographic is expecting images, and these wolves are hiding in the forest, they're not coming out. So Paul says to me, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna go up to the creek, and I'm going to find these wolves. And I'm like, please don't go. You're gonna ruin everything. But he just can't take it, so he goes. And the minute he turns the creek over, he's on a paddleboard, on a kayak, I see a wolf for the first time come out into the meadow, and then I hear this cacophony of wolf calls in the forest where Paul had gone in. What had happened is he intercepted the entire pack, they were bringing the babies out. If we just sat there, the minute they saw Paul standing there in the middle of the creek, they all freaked out, and it took us another 3 weeks before they would eventually come out again.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I think this is a good transition to looking at some of these images. And I wanted to kind of frame that actually with someone that you mentioned again, Peter Drombovskis, if I'm saying that right.
Yes.
And he said, I'm just pulling this from what you wrote, but I think it's really poignant. And he said that something of the photographer should be evident in every image. Something of how the photographer felt should leap from every photo. So I'm going to see now if I can share my screen and share some of your images, and just for you to talk through the images. And please, for the audience here, do let us know if this isn't working and we can fix it. So I'm going to try and see if I can get this to work here. Let's have a look.
And while you're doing that, Zach View, I see your comment. What a fantastic story. That's just half of the story. When Ross puts the picture on, I'll tell the rest of the story.
How's that? Can you guys see that? Can you see?
They're asking if Cristina Mittermeier is on Instagram. Yes, I go by Mitty, M-I-T-T-Y. And there's a wolf photo in my post yesterday.
Uh-huh. So can you see this image, Cristina? It's the image of the I think it's, I don't know if it's a female wolf, it looks like it, on the log with the cubs. Okay. No, I cannot see it. So I'm gonna see if our audience saw that. 1 second. I can't see it. Okay, let me try again. 1 second. How about now? No, 1 second. Let me just try again here. Share screen. Here we go. How about
there we go. Oh, these wolves. So this was one of those days where we actually were not looking for wolves. We were on a boat, and just going along the coast here, just like anybody else. Fishermen do it, hunters do it. They just go around the little fjords. And somebody had a pair of binoculars and they thought they saw driftwood on the beach. And then one of the pieces of driftwood moved and we realized it was 5 wolf pups. As often happens with these packs, the rest of the pack had left for the day. They were out hunting, and these pups were left with a single wolf sitter taking care of them. And we spent all day sitting across the little creek from where they were, watching them play and sun themselves in the beautiful, beautiful beach. At some point, as the day of the day is ending, the light is dwindling, the mother came back and these babies were so excited to see her and they started howling. There's a video I have of these 5 baby pups howling. It's just so beautiful. And they know we were there, but if you've been sitting there all day and you haven't posed the threat, wolves are very smart and they know you're not going to pull one on them. So it's amazing when an animal allows you into their world and you feel for a brief second you were part of a wolf pack.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious if I know you're a dog owner yourself, like how familiar some of that behavior is.
Paul and I were just having a conversation this afternoon. We have 2 Mexican rescues. They're both like mixed breeds, lab with the Ridgeback, and they can be really obedient, but they can be very selectively disobedient. So I say, Pingo, come, and Pingo decides that he's not coming. And so I was asking Paul, I was saying, what are we doing wrong with these dogs? And he was saying, well, if you are the alpha in a wolf pack, you don't go and kiss the puppies. You don't get in bed with them. You don't talk to them. The alpha is very dominant. But we, because these are our babies and our pups, we send them mixed signals. They are not completely sure that we are the alpha.
That's funny.
But dogs and wolves both need an alpha. They really crave that leadership, and dominance and leadership is not the same as abusiveness, just to be clear.
Can you now see a different image?
No, I still see the same one. I'm gonna scroll through messages while you figure it out.
I'm doing a technology fail here, but let me just see.
David Mesh disproved the alpha theory. I'd love to hear how.
Let's have a look. How about this one? You see this now?
Yes, these the completely different area. These were 2 female wolves that were living on an island off of Vancouver Island, and all the locals were very familiar with them, and so they were very easy to find, and they were very, very cocky, these 2 females. And the families there just knew them, so it was easy to get to them. There's not much special I can tell you about these females, except that they're very familiar to the people that live on these islands, and most of them consider them, community members. But every once in a while, a hunter will come and shoot them.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. I wanted to pick a different image, and it's like the thing that stands out, like we can see are the canines and so on, that kind of make, like often lead to this idea about wolves being particularly scary, as opposed to, I'm curious, like it looks like the end of a yawn.
She was yawning, but I mean, make no mistake, wolves are very smart, and I don't think they pose a serious threat to human most of the time. But if you leave your food around in a campsite, they're going to be curious and they're going to come, and they've been known to scare people. And you know what? They're conditioned to go after small mammals. So if you have a little dog, guess what? You're making him prey. Mm-hmm. Don't bring little dogs to the beach if there's wolves.
Yeah, I think we see it, like we might discuss this in some of the later episodes, just about the...
Thanks, Oliver. I'm going to look at that YouTube link when we're done here.
Okay, I'm going to just pick another image here, see if this works. Not sure.
And I want to clarify, because for this assignment, I was the assistant. So if you are somebody's assistant, a photographer's assistant, you're not supposed to be taking pictures. So this is not my best work. It was just found shots. The photographer who was doing the beautiful work was Paul.
Can you see this image?
Not yet.
Okay.
It wants to come. We have a white screen.
Bring your shared window to front. 1 second. Let's just see if I can do that.
I see your Dropbox list.
1 second, so I'm going to do that.
Yeah, and I agree with Claudia that people that shoot wolves for fun are psychopaths. I just can't imagine why.
Let's see. There we go. I think I'm doing it now. How about that?
Oh, yeah. So this is completely different location. Early morning, dingy ride, super foggy. When out of the fog comes this storm, and it goes all the way to the edge of the water, and it starts digging amongst the seaweed, looking for barnacles, looking for oysters. As Chris has documented so many times, the diet of these coastal wolves is largely marine, which is so unusual. Mm-hmm. And this wolf was just rummaging, he was looking for a dead fish but we know that these wolves are capable of killing sea lions and seals. And just very opportunistic, taking advantage of the bounty of the coast of British Columbia, where there's so much food that the ocean leaves every low tide. So they just help themselves to that.
Hmm. And how long did it, how many other, I know there, I've seen some of the other images, but I'm kind of curious, if you give us a sense of, this is, and I know you actually, thank you very much, you allowed us to use this image for some fundraising that we did a year or so ago, but I'm kind of curious, how many other versions or how many other shots of this wolf did you take, just to give us a sense of this.
So you know what ends up happening, because when we're working like that, I oftentimes at the end of the day just do a quick scan. I grab my couple of favorite images and then I never look at it again. But just a week ago, I went back to this precise shoot and I looked again and I found about 40 different takes of this image. So there's the small wolf, it's walking in the background, and there's the little wolf sitting watching at us. And so I sent them we still work with our editor at National Geographic, and he's got an incredible eye for these images. So I just sent them to him and he found 3 more that he likes. Yeah. So hopefully I'll be sharing those soon. It was a beautiful, one of those British Columbia mornings where you have to pinch yourself that we live in such a beautiful place. So it's misty and it's a little cold and it smells like seaweed, and out of this mist comes a wolf. It's incredible.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what it actually feels like. In some ways we kind of, we might not want the animals to necessarily engage with us, but sometimes they're gonna, right? We can't control what they do, and they might think, like you were saying, you're in the hide, and they kind of, or maybe you on a vessel, and they are kind of engaging you directly. And I'm kind of curious what that actually feels like.
It was very interesting because wolves are like dogs, and if they don't feel confident, they go into a pose where they tuck their tail between their legs, and that's never a good picture. So if you want to make a beautiful wolf photo, that animal needs to feel very confident around you. So the previous 2 or 3 shots of this particular image, this wolf is actually eating something, and I can't tell what it is. I don't know if it's like a gooseneck barnacle, or I'm going to send them to Chris Deramont so maybe he can tell me what he was eating. But he knew we were there and just picked up his head, looked at us, and then carried on doing whatever he was doing. And, that's what you want to see. He's got his ears perked up. He's not afraid. He doesn't feel threatened. He's just curious.
Yeah.
And you feel very, like your breath leaves you, right? There's a wolf right there. And it's not going to last very long. So you're very nervous. You're trying to, create images that are properly composed and properly exposed, and you're fiddling with your gear, and you're in a dinghy that's moving around with the waves, and it's chaotic most of the time.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, while they leave this image up, if you can see, can you see the questions there at the moment, Cristina?
I see them, yeah, and I thank you so much for these great questions. And I hope, I don't know if there's a way to save some of these questions. I'd love to respond to some of them.
Yeah, we can take a couple now if you can see them, because it's hard for me to kind of jump between the two. I'm wondering would you be open to just taking a couple now as we go along?
Sure. Some people are talking about red wolves and Mexican gray wolves. And isn't that the truth, that I'm going to say all species of wolves are different. And if you take time to really study how different they are, they're all so beautiful, and you can start understanding how they evolved to different environments and how they've been adapting for hundreds, thousands of years to look and behave, to take advantage of their environment. And I will say this, every ecosystem where there's wolves is a better place because there's wolves. As keystone species, they maintain the diversity we need for ecosystems to thrive. And this is something I really have been thinking about in the face of COVID. You know, when you remove diversity from ecosystems by taking out wildlife, either by hunting or trapping or deforestation, whatever it is, that ecosystem loses resilience. And as a result, it becomes a place where viruses may thrive, where disease certainly will thrive, or invasive species will thrive. So we need species like wolves to maintain the resilience of the ecosystem. I've been watching, I was watching a beautiful documentary the night before last, for anybody who's looking for something to watch tonight. It's called Little Big Farm, and it's about a couple that restores the vitality and diversity to a piece of land that's dead. And one of the key things is that coyotes come back, you know, and they too maintain the diversity and the balance of the ecosystem, and wolves do the same.
Yeah, Paul spoke a little bit about this in some of the episodes, and a lot of our colleagues, Heather Bryan's work related to this, like this importance of the role they play, and you know, like also the susceptibility of canids to viruses themselves, even though they're pretty tolerant because of the nature of their diet. They're also susceptible to things that humans can bring in that they haven't evolved to cope with, like beyond the obvious, which might be bullets and traps, but also with viruses that are introduced into a system in which they didn't naturally occur.
Yeah, so somebody's asking me the name of the documentary. It's called Little Big Farm. I put it there in the comments.
Great, okay. I'm going to move on to the next image here. I'm going to try and move on to the next image here. Let's see if I can do it.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, I need to do...
You know, every time you go out into nature and you encounter an animal like a wolf or bear, you just feel lucky. And I just feel grateful that they're still there. Mm-hmm. And so organizations like Raincoast that do so much and so clever to protect these species and their habitats, it's such a joy to collaborate with you.
Thank you. Can you see the image? Yeah.
So this is the second part of the story. I was telling you earlier when Paul and I were sitting in a blind for 3 weeks and he had told me not to move. And then he went out and he scared the wolves. So 3 more weeks passed and no wolves. You know, we sat there on the blind watching the tide come up and the tide go down. It just gets so tedious. And the highlight of those 3 weeks was one day when I looked behind us and there was a wolf sitting right behind us. Who knows how long he'd been sitting there just watching us. But 3 weeks passed and Paul was growing desperate at this point. And so he turned to me and he said, I'm going to go again. I'm going to take the kayak. I'm going to go upstream and look for the wolves. And I said, please don't go. You know, we've been sitting here, you know, earning the right to see these animals. But he didn't listen. And so he went. I was reading my book, The Blind, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving, you know, in the distance, probably 250 meters away. And I thought it was a raccoon. So I picked up the binoculars and I looked, and it was one of these pups. And then behind it, another one and another one. There were 5 pups and the mom, and they're all coming towards me. So I picked up the radio and I'm like, Paul, the wolves are coming. I was so torn because it was not my assignment. They were not my pictures to take, but there's these pups there. And they came right in front of me in the meadow and they started playing, this is a piece of bull kelp, and they're playing tug of war, and they were so cute. And the mother knew exactly where I was. She looked at me straight through the blind, and then she just turned around and walked away, and she left them there. And I felt like she had just left the pups, you know, with me babysitting while she went up on her way, and they spent 20 minutes playing. And at the end of 20 minutes, I saw Paul coming in very quietly on the kayak. And, you know, it was getting dark. He lost the opportunity. He was so upset. And I just had the most magical 20 minutes with these puppies.
I'm kind of curious because I can kind of, like, there's another piece to that, right? Like this, like your sense that, like, and we actually hear this a lot with, like, you know, grizzly bears, female grizzly bears, you know, especially since we started buying, like, ending parts of the trophy hunting in British Columbia and so on and so forth, that, like, the female bears would be much more comfortable almost leaving the, you know, tourist or ecotourism operators minding the cubs, and they're more fearful of the presence of a male bear. So I'm kind of curious about, like, how does that feel, the idea that, like, this wild animal who you've been trying to, experience or witness for so long, comes out and even if it's just the impression that seemingly kind of leaves you in charge of the pups, or at least leaves you in the presence of the pups.
It happened so fast, Ross, and I was so flustered, trying to get Paul to come back and it was getting very dark. This photograph was taken like with 6,000 ISO. Wow. So if you look at it carefully, it's very grainy. And somebody was asking if they used it for the assignment, and the answer is no. We sat there for another 3 weeks until eventually they came out, and Paul took a beautiful and very famous picture of the same pups. One of them is playing with an eagle feather. It's very cute. You have to put in the time, and it's never easy. There is something really powerful about having the opportunity to have the time to just sit in nature, and you listen to the ravens calling, and you listen to the water, and it just puts you in a different state, and it's unforgettable.
Yeah, it's you do get a sense of the playfulness of this. Like, Justin, I've seen this image shared by you before, and just like a bit of the story of it, but it's really cool to hear like a fuller version of the story. And just I just bumped into a new pup on my street before we started this session. I can kind of imagine myself playing with these wolf pups, even though I know that probably wouldn't be that wise.
So true. It's somebody saying that it never gets old. The adrenaline rush of seeing a wild animal is always so powerful.
Yeah. I'm gonna move off the image now and just see if we can. Let's have a look. Take a few more questions here.
For how long am I in the field? Depends on the assignment. Like last week, Paul went up the island and spent a week camping with a pack of wolves, the ones that are eating that sperm whale. And just in a week, he went there to do video, and he filmed beautiful sequences. But again, he was writing me every night on the satellite phone saying, "Oh my God, all day in the blind, they didn't come out." It's tedious. You have to be willing to put in time.
Yeah. There's a question here about what do you think is the best angle to photograph an animal to make people care? Would you photograph them struggling, portray their beauty, or some other way?
Oh, such a good question. I think it's an interesting question, because I think women and men photograph animals in a very different way. I find that a lot of my male colleagues are looking for action, they want the animal doing something exciting. Whereas I much prefer a quiet image of an animal in its environment. Images where an animal is looking at you, you've been discovered, and I think it loses a little bit of the magic, but some people do think that the eyes are the windows of the soul. So having a good portrait of an animal. But in the case of animals that are difficult to photograph, you're just happy with any angle. Whatever angle you can get.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a different question. It's asked of both of us with regards to like the culling of wolves. And I'm kind of going to paraphrase the question a little bit. And well, maybe not. Maybe I won't paraphrase it. I'll read it. I would like to ask you both, actually, with respect to your work and the ability to use your voices collectively to address the culling of wolves that BC Premier Horgan ordered this past July, allowing killings by contracted helicopter hunters hired. What would your approach be for his office to pay attention and to answer to this effectively? I'm kind of curious I have an answer to that. I'm kind of curious to hear what you would say first.
Well, first of all, I think it's criminal, and I think it's completely unnecessary, and I think it's completely misguided, and I don't think it's the answer at all. I think it's a bad band-aid for a problem that was created by people. So first of all, I don't condone the culling of wolves in any shape or form. What I do is I try to partner with organizations that are doing the policy and the advocacy work. I try to be a really good partner to Raincoast because I think they're the most effective. And I try to use my social media and my own voice to give interviews and to speak about diversity in nature brings resilience. This is the most important thing. And wolves are part of that ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Like we launched like a part of the reason why we do this whole wolf school in the first place is that we saw what happened with Takaya, the wolf that was living off Vancouver Island, as as maybe a useful point to kind of refocus attention on wolves in British Columbia. And similarly, like other organizations, we're opposed to the culling of wolves, and also the reality that more wolves are culled simply for recreation than are culled. To answer the question, I think one way is, the reality is you can contact your elected officials. They're there to represent you, both as a premier of the province, and then your MLAs are there to represent your wishes, to that provincial government. So there is a tool that on our website, and we'll share the link, where you can send your message of support for conservation of wolves to the province. And we would always, as an organization, encourage you to engage with your elected officials that represent you and let them know about what your concerns are and ask them questions. That's always a key thing. Like it can be very easy to kind of click a button and send a petition and things like that, and those things are valuable for sure. And like your elected officials have a duty to respond to your questions. So it can be much more effective to write them a written letter, or even request a meeting and ask that they address your concerns. So that's one thing that we would suggest that you could do with regards to that. There's some other questions here that I want to go through.
Yes, and I would say to everybody, I know that it feels overwhelming and we're all bombarded with petitions, and it feels like our small action doesn't create a difference. But I want to say yes to everything that Ross just said. Please sign petitions, please write letters. It makes a difference, and we can only make a difference if it's all of us. It cannot just be a handful of us. So every day, dedicate 10 minutes to your favorite issue and write a letter, write an email.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, definitely. And we will talk about in the last episode, we'll have Chris Darmont, who's a director of science at Raincoast and leads our lab at the University of Victoria, and Paul Paquette. We're talking particularly around conservation of wolves in British Columbia. There's another question here I think is interesting. Cristina, have you ever been in a position where you decided not to take photos out of fear of attracting too much attention to a vulnerable animal group? And I think this is very relevant to wolves in British Columbia, so I'm kind of curious to your answer there.
Absolutely. We have done that, where we've decided not to take pictures because it was an area that could be easily identified. And it's happened before, where somebody posts a picture of a pack of wolves and the next thing you know, there's hunters on them. So you have to be so careful never to disclose the locations where you see these animals, especially when they have pups. They're so vulnerable. And for me, people were asking, why would anybody hunt a wolf? Yeah, I don't know, but some people find great thrill and fun in killing animals for sport. I suppose for some indigenous cultures, they have to hunt and kill animals, but I think we have to craft a different relationship with nature, one that is born out of respect and understanding of the value that every species brings to the entire system. And somebody was telling me how these wolves are called from helicopters, Ross, and I found it so disturbing. Where they color one of the wolves and it's called a Judas wolf. When it goes back to the pack, they find the rest of the pack and then they kill them all.
Yeah, I think it just makes, obviously the story is the one that we relate to, but it just is particularly galling. And I think that's, it relates back to this idea of the welfare of individual animals. And the issues around wolf conservation are complex for sure, but I think increasingly we just need to consider the ethics of our impact on these animals. And this is something we'll talk to in the last episode about the complexities of, like what are the justifications, if you agree with them, around wolf culls for, say, dealing with issues for caribou, which Raincoast has published about and Chris Darmont has published about recently, that calls into question some of the confidence we might have about the efficacy of those measures. But that's something that we're going to return to for sure, because it is a really big issue.
It absolutely is. And if you guys want to feel a little more hopeful, I've been reading this by my friend Enrique Sala, The Nature of Nature, and I highly recommend it. It's lifted my soul, and it's reinvigorated my determination to keep fighting for nature. So
that's good. You're preempting one of my questions towards the end. Like, I was going to quote some more text, but you talked about, like, somewhere else, I can't even remember where I pulled this from, but I thought it was really important, about the frustration of youth and like about like wanting things to happen quickly, and often in certainly in science and even in conservation, things don't happen quickly often, right? So I'm kind of curious if you can share a little bit more, like I think I love it that you're referencing a book that helps inspire you, but because like my experience of you, Cristina, like certainly on this call and previously, is you do have this enthusiasm and this passion for things, and you're obviously exposed and really well informed about these issues that really can be overwhelming. So I'm kind of curious, like for my own personal interest as well, like what keeps you so passionate and positive? Like what do you do to keep yourself inspired and driven?
I think that's the best question you've asked so far, among many, many good questions today. But I'm looking out the window as we're talking, and I'm seeing the sun kiss just the tops of the trees. You know, nature is so beautiful. It doesn't matter where you are. I want it to be that way. And the only way that it's going to stay that way is if I'm willing to stand up and fight for it and be passionate about it. And nobody wants to hear us being negative and, you know, doom and gloom. We have to lead with passion. I like to talk about my favorite speech of all time is Martin Luther King, you know, dealing with civic rights in the United States. And his most famous speech doesn't say, "I have a nightmare." You know, he talks about the dream he has. And if we want to get to the future we see in our minds, we have to be able to articulate it with our words, with our vision, with our enthusiasm. And it starts with every one of us. At the dinner table tonight, talk to somebody else about your love of nature, what it means for you, and the importance for everybody on this planet to maintain a healthy living ecosystem.
Yeah, and I wanted to and thank you. That's a great answer. Like I kind of do similarly. I sit on my desk a lot of the time, and I'm fortunate to have a decent view of the city I rent, by the way. I couldn't afford to buy. I live in Vancouver. But I'm constantly kind of like, I'll be on a call and I'll be inspired and distracted because there'll be a turkey vulture or an eagle or a hawk, which are the things that particularly get my attention, right? And I'm like, okay. And then for a moment, I'm kind of re-inspired and re-engaged, and then get back to the emails and so on.
Yeah, and somebody was just saying, you know, go vegan. Whatever changes in your life that you can make to have a lesser footprint on this planet are welcome. I'm not vegan because I believe that there's especially some wild foods and aquaculture that are good for the local economy. Like I like scallops, you know, and I don't think there's a major issue with scallops being grown in aquaculture, but they support a very important local economy. And I think educate yourself. The most difficult thing about caring is that it takes a lot of work to understand that the impact of everything we buy, of every decision we make, is enormous. And it breaks my heart, especially when young people say things like, "I don't want to vote because I'm not into politics." You know, we have to be into politics. The people that make the decisions on our behalf, you know, we need to select those who care about the future of our planet. And so please vote, and please vote for somebody who cares.
Yeah, there's a question here that relates to that, and I can certainly relate to this question. And it says, if we are not a Canadian citizen, is there still a way we can bring conservation awareness to the Canadian government?
I think so. I mean, well, you have great petitions every once in a while. We are going to do a fundraiser together. You want to talk about that, Ross? I'm so excited by that.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we'll like one of the ways in which we are ending the trophy hunting of large carnivores, coastal carnivores, is to basically buy the rights to shoot the animals and then not shoot them, which is something that we were inspired to do a long time ago, primarily with the goal of ending the trophy hunting of grizzly bears. So now that has been outlawed throughout the province, we're continuing that, and basically in partnership with different coastal First Nations, we acquire the commercial hunting rights. So that's not all the rights, but if you're not a resident of British Columbia and you want to come and shoot its wildlife, you can do that, but you have to go with a licensed guide. And so what we've been doing with the support of the various coastal First Nations, I want to make that really abundantly clear, is to buy those rights. So therefore, if you're not a resident and you want to shoot grizzly bears, or previously grizzly bears or black bears or wolves, in large parts of what's now the Great Bear Rainforest, you can only come with Raincoast, and we tend to take people.
Guess what? They're not taking you.
Oh yeah. So we will definitely share. Thanks for that. We will definitely share more about that. We're pretty close to being in the home straight of acquiring the hunting rights in an area called the Kitlope, which is, yeah, it's one of the...
A special place.
Yeah, it is. There's some really fantastic books, and there's a lot of information on our website about that. We're kind of coming to time, so thanks for that question. Like, we will share more about that in our last episode, and you can learn more online. I wanted to do some quick thank yous, and we might run over by a minute or so, but I'll just accept that if people need to sign off, they can do that. So first of all, thanks to you, Cristina. I found this really enjoyable and inspiring and informative, and I really appreciate the time that you put in, like prepping for this, and also like the time. I really appreciate your support for Raincoast. It means a lot to us. It really
Love
does.
Raincoast. Thank you for what you do.
Yeah. And also thanks to our audience. Like, thank you. Like we see you signing in. It's inspiring to see so much engagement and the questions. We really encourage you to keep coming to the next episodes of Wolf School. We didn't really get time to go into it, but I'm sure if you want to learn more about Cristina's work, you can follow her on Instagram, and you can follow Sea Legacy and the fantastic work they do. And I think there's going to be some more interesting announcements about Only One. Is that right? That's coming. Do you want to say something about that, Cristina, before we close?
Yes, Only One. So Paul and I wanted to enable our followers to do more than like or share, but to be able to be part of this community of activists. So we built a storytelling platform that gives you activation opportunities. So if we tell a beautiful story about coastal wolves in British Columbia, we will ask our followers to take an action on Raincoast's petitions, or to donate to Raincoast or to any of our other partners. And we do this with stories from around the world. So together we can make a big difference, because we only have one planet and we only have one ocean. And it only takes one small action to make a big difference.
Wow. We seem to manage to fluke to end it with something poignant like that. So I kind of want to close it there. Please do join us next week. We will make notes. We'll make the session live, and we'll try and share and answer some of these questions in different ways when we can get to it. And with that, I kind of really encourage you to join us next week. We're going to look at Indigenous perspectives on wolves and wolf conservation. We have a really fantastic lineup for you. Once more, thanks to all of you, and thanks to Cristina. And with that, we're going to end and say good night. Thank you all very much.
Thanks to everyone. Good night.
Take care.
Bye.